participate once.
That would be good.
Yes, and in the Motion DAO also, there's one of the guy who told me he wrote a thesis on this text as well. So a long time ago, something like this.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That sounds good.
And so so I wanted maybe to share, like to get your feedback on my proposition of interpretation. There was like really interesting things to me. I tried to summarize them and maybe get your feelings about it. What you think. Does it really, to me, I mean, so if you want, in very short, all this in very short and probably somehow superficial, the presentation of Georges Bataille in this book that he said he wrote as an economic book is basically that it's all about, gift and counter gift, that any exchange is about that, and that ultimately we are doing these things about the gift and counter gift with the sun, and we are always going to lose, because with these things, like for example, if you have one king is going to give you something, so the other king is going to give more to affirm his power, this kind of thing, and ultimately it's with the sun, and with the sun you always lose. So that's one of the idea and of acknowledging how much in our human traditions the sun is perceived as a power of energy, even in very ancient time, and how big it is, like it's a huge energy that we can benefit from, but we are so small from that. And the other thing again, I'm oversimplifying probably very much, is the fact that you use so he has this economic idea that you use the energy to feed your needs, and your needs to grow as an organism, to live and to reproduce. And the extra energy that you have once all these needs are fed need to be destroyed, consumption. And the way he described this, it's exactly what you have in dynamic energy budget, the way of analyzing organism. And then this idea of consumption culture as a need for destruction. Consumption is destruction, or is consumption. It's for him. It's so he doesn't talk about consumer culture, but in what I read, but this idea that we are made to have the energy circulate for some kind of biological needs, and the rest has to be destroyed, and all this destruction is this power game of gift and counter gift, something like this. And this connects. So then maybe we are condemned to destroy this over gift of energy. Okay, so I stop. But in the last, no, I don't want to stop. Sorry. Can I speak a few more minutes? Do you mind?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You're leading this call, so
I'm trying to share my okay, it's in the text. So I made this very simple graph on energy usage. So when you since you have this idea of the energy that you don't use, which is destroyed in some kind of power games, then it means that we use the energy for our metabolism, let's say metabolism in a very right sense, understanding. But what we don't use for is for imagination, symbolism, everything related to culture and structure. So this is this little graph I did at the end of the page. But I thought that this was very interesting, actually. The fact that the energy is also used for symbolism, but for what, because we need all this symbolism and interaction as a culture, as a human culture. And so Bataille is talking about this gift and counter gift and the destruction that we are condemned to do. And so maybe we have to think about something else. Because we know more about consumer culture than Bataille 70 years ago, you know, like we know how terrible it is. So it's also a very different way of looking at what could be next to consumer culture in terms of sustainability, you know, in terms of just, okay, we need to have plastic that is recycled, blah, blah, blah. So no, we it's not going, if you listen to what he says, we're not going to save the world like this. And maybe this one can help us. And then it connects to all this philosophy of relation that we're going to work on in another day from this other philosopher, Edouard Glissant, which I'm totally convinced, and he's a, you know, younger, he died only a few years ago. I'm really sure that Edouard Glissant can help us a lot. And I think he's one of the most interesting philosophers to understand today's world. Okay, I stop. I let you speak now.
Well, the stuff that you talked about is something like that me, Andrea, and Nate have talked about just as friends in general. And I think that's being interested in this stuff is kind of like what draws us together a lot. And your description of like giving, or the gift and the power dynamics around gifting, I guess you could say, like I understand. Well, I think I know what you're talking about. Like I think I tried to describe it to you before in our past call. Like, remember when I was like onboarding you, when I was describing like every living thing as like a blob, and then anytime you converse or interact with anyone else, you're giving them a part of your blob, so you're giving them energy and they're consuming it and it becomes a part of them. And if you give too much of yourself, it gets taken away, or you lose yourself, and the other person becomes full of too much of you and they lose themselves too. It's like that overconsumption. But how things work now, it's like things just get taken, or in conversation you give your blob to someone or a part of you to someone, and then it gets thrown away because it's just like, oh, everyone's, well, not everyone, but like there's a lot of information out there, and it almost feels like it's just it adds to the noise and therefore it's not valuable. But actually it's like it's someone giving you a part of themselves. And I think that way for everything, like even materials, when you interact with materials, you know, like when you use it, could you leave it intact or better than it was before after use? Is that a thing that's possible? These are the kind of things that like I've been thinking about for some time, just because it kind of relates to my personal myth that I came up with.
And
Maybe
what do you think about
2019?
Sorry.
No, carry on. What you I think
I just
about?
wanted to ask you, how do you relate what you just said to, you know, personal data that are sold, blah 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 blah?
Sorry, I did talk a lot. Well, I'm kind of I synthesize it in this idea for like the prototype for the first version of, well, prototype for the dynamic energy budgets research, because you talked about like coming up with a prototype together. So I had this idea for an app just for myself, just like for fun, and then Shabnam said maybe we should just build it for all, and then I thought, well, maybe we could just base it off of the research that Jean has done. So I was thinking of like working in the research plus like I guess my personal philosophy into it. And I think I mentioned I saw you looking at the Figma for it. I think you saw like the plan for it. It's like the regenerative workflow app.
Yeah, I saw it. But I wonder, I mean, I still think that there's a difference between an understanding or a myth or a story we tell ourselves, I mean, for us, with this app, which would work individually, and how we can think in terms of, when I'm thinking of imagination, based on the inspiration from Georges Bataille, I'm thinking of more something as society. So, for example, not only him, interprets wars or the building of pyramids as a way to destroy this surplus of energy. There's some connection, but I think we need to be able to go from one to the other level. And that's also interesting in terms of metabolism, because all the idea is to think of metabolism as a, an ecosystem. I don't want to say society, but an ecosystem. Or if we are more concrete, we want to think of a metabolism as a art science laboratory. If we go back to Satori, you wanted to speak? Or...
Oh no, I was just saying about what you were talking about in this like larger sense, because when you were talking about like the pyramids and like this, because like the space program was like that in more of a positive sense, instead of like war, like it galvanized like the society's imagination to like put in these resources for something that was like abstract, going to like the moon or whatever. In this sense, like mythically for us, in a meta sense, like the concealance library is like this thing that's like trying to galvanize, these efforts to put this like excess resources to something, I guess, meaningful or useful. In this sense, that's what I'm thinking right now.
But so when I don't know, I don't know, Steph and Satori, if like we are on the page that I shared with you, like excess of energy, this page on the Notion. I don't know if you can.
I read that.
It's not there. Okay, and this idea of using this excess of energy for different type of imagination. I think that would be something interesting for us to dig in. But I was wondering, Satori, because you were talking about the research that you wanted to do, or you were doing about the Aztec, of this gift and counter gift. If you can, share something with us about that.
Yeah. And because it was funny when I briefly looked at the text and it had about the Aztecs, and actually even the potluck, or what later becomes potluck in like the native culture of like these ceremonies of gifting. So I read this ancient text, and it has like the hieroglyphs, but it has the story that goes along with it. And in the story, the whole story is about the sun. The sun creates the earth, and we have to be in relationship to the sun and be stewards and protect the earth, which protects us. And like that's the whole like basic of this myth. So when I read the text, I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting because, you know, I've been thinking about how, even for my own self, you know, what Nick was saying personally, our own way we make sense of the world. But I think what you said in the text is the study of a system, production, and consumption within a larger framework. And even today, I was watching the news and they were talking about Netflix's stock going down and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but like I think that company was overvalued to begin with. And like that like kind of like, oh my god, it lost all this money. I was like, yeah, I don't even think it was like properly evaluated in that sense. And like the games that like get played in this like weird little dance of marketing and markets and how things really shift. And I just was thinking about like it's not tied, their evaluation is not tied to the actual like production and consumption like in like real reality. Like you know, there's so many different avenues to stream, so like even if they have those subscribers, are those like real subscribers? You know, like even on the internet, like are these bots, are these like empty hollowed like numbers, or are they like real living numbers? And thinking about it in that way, and you know, kind of like dovetailing it into now and the text of how I do it. But yeah, I'm just my thoughts of reading it and the things that I've been thinking about. Even too, I think this metabolism space of you know, related to our work is important. And I think later where you're talking about relation and this giving space and that relationship is important in having a more, even for us to have our own personal workflow, and then within the greater whole of how we relate to each other, and then into the greater whole of, I think what I want to represent in the first, the concealants, like flower that Steph made, but like 3 versions of the workflow. But later it adds to a bigger picture of like the mandala that like represents the greater like symbol. And I think that's kind of what I was reading in your chart, you know, kind of like flipping the culture of this kind of like consumption destruction into like this more like, that's what I think about like inverting, when I keep on saying about inverting the logic and this flipping the pyramid scheme. I kind of mean about like returning it into this more flow, natural flow, and that's what I think about.
But
Yeah.
But why are you talking about returning to that? Because my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding is that actually this is what we do, humans, with the surplus of energy.
Yeah.
And we do destroy. So suddenly when I was reading that, I was like, okay, so finally consumption culture is just what came out after the pyramid and all the war, you know? I mean, we do have the wars as well, but you know, what do you think?
Yeah. And you know, that kind of like goes into like, that's the like the consumer culture is like what, like kind of the new version of like sacrificing our energy for the greater
it's a destruction.
market?
It's a destruction. So the idea is that to have this idea of destruction of the surplus. So what I wanted to say is that so you have this power. I mean, again, I'm not a specialist so of his philosophy, but so there's this power game with giving, gift, and counter gift. So there's also something important that he talks about, which is we are thinking of economy at a larger scale in the same level than at a small scale, as a separate entity. So we expect the economy would function like if you produce a car and get paid and he has a description like this, that's saying that we in order to study economy, we need to create it as an object, and so it means we need to separate ourselves from this object of study. And it's very interesting because this is, to me, more and more what I'm interested in, is that how we can, this is the idea of the metabolism, how we can be part of a system and learn from it in the same time. You know, it's finished, this idea to separate in order to have an object and study it. And when you go in the discussion with, you know, what is science, blah blah blah, and how much you can, you know, separate this object, you have some questioning about this these days. So it means that it's an additional information that it's questioning that is raising these days in the world, you know. So how can we be part of a metabolism, of an ecosystem? How can we continue to think as human while acknowledging that we are belonging to something that is bigger than us? And here it's the sun, you know. So how can we think this way? And it's the same with the fact that actually, you know, with these things of solar energy, we are full of energy. So it's very interesting. We can think about climate change in a very different way. And so it connects to relation, you know, it connects to all. We need to think about what relation means. And if we can have a different type of relation, and actually, Nick, when you were talking about losing yourself, when, you know, which I understand very well what you're talking about, Edouard Glissant, he talks about that, but he talks about this about with the foreigner, because he comes from Martinique, from the inheritage of slavery and colonialism. And he said how we can go and meet the other, but leave him being the other, not converting him. And again, I'm not a specialist of him, but not yet. No, I mean, I'm talking like, but not yet. But that's very interesting for us at a time where, you know, the world is getting smaller and blah blah blah, and we are like post-colonialism, blah blah blah. But I think if we are able to think of relation by being within and not separated, that could be a great ground for the research, and maybe for a prototype of different type of interactions on economy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's kind of funny when you said other. There's something that Doug for a long time within like the Team Human stuff. He had this phrase, "Find the others," and it comes from like Timothy Leary. But anyways, like the point was kind of like what you were saying is like, and I think that's my point too with the narrative mandala, is like keeping intact like that person's point of view and like how they see it. Not in like, you know what you're saying, like in that kind of detached way, in not evaluating, but just simply as it is, which is kind of funny. What Doug was kind of like pushing some of us in the community to like, he was like, find the others, not the others that he meant. He didn't mean like your own like mimetic tribe, your own people that like, you know, wear your same hat or whatever, but like the others like on the other side, like different cultures and different thoughts and people that think differently than you. Those were the others that you needed to find in that phrase. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up with what I learned from Doug. And
it's interesting because to me the mandala, there's something about, and aesthetics in general, it's a kind of pattern that you recognize. So I would recognize myself in something like the mandala you proposed to me, because I'm going to find it beautiful. I see a bit of my own humanity in your mandala. So it's a way to connect as well.
Yeah, yeah. When you, especially too when you're talking about symbols and like in your little chart.